Hello, welcome. Welcome everybody to the Austin Energy Leaders Breakfast and Roundtable. My name is Georg. I'm the CEO of Gridraven. I'm here to welcome you today. I'm personally very happy that you've all made it here. As I said to some of you, I've moved to Austin 2 months ago. So for me, I'm new to town, but I'm here to stay, and really happy to be diving deep into energy topics in Texas with a wonderful, esteemed panel right after the introduction. So the order of today, what you can expect now is we'll have a panel discussion for 1 hour. You can think of questions that you would like to ask the panelists, and you will have an opportunity to ask questions at the end of the panel. And then we will do, after the panel, a launch of the Gridraven product, which is a launch event. And after that, I will go through original research into the economic impact of the product in Texas based on real data. So that's the order of the day, and we'll adjourn by around 11:30 or so, just before noon. The topic of the panel is how to balance affordability, growth, and reliability in the Texas grid. Over the past summer, Texas saw record total energy use, and also electricity rates have been rising. They're about 5% up from last year, and that's in Texas, but also nationwide. Nationwide rates have been rising by 1 or 2%. So rates have been rising faster in Texas than in the rest of the states. So how do we keep reliability? How do we keep energy reliable? So that means that we can keep the lights on and houses heated while keeping prices under control. That's the topic of the panel. To my right, we have Doug Lewin, who's the founder of Stoic Energy, also host of the Energy Capital podcast and Texas Energy and Power newsletter, a nationally recognized energy expert. Then we have Patricia Zavala, who's the executive director of PowerHouse Texas, which is active in the capital here in Austin, Texas. And we have Dr. Joshua Rhodes, a lecturer at the University of Texas at Austin, and also a commissioner of the City of Austin Electricity Commission. And then we have Jack Farley, who's the Chief Commercial Officer at Grid United, which is a company building transmission across the states. So we have a great perspective and view on energy topics. And we'll start off perhaps by asking you to set the scene a little bit. I've already mentioned increases in consumption, increases in rates, but what's really behind that? What's going on? What's the lay of the land, and where are we?
4 years ago in Texas, our total energy consumption was about 400 terawatt hours, a little bit less actually. By the end of this year, if the next 3 months go as the last 9 months of this year have gone, we'll be just shy of 500 terawatt hours, probably 485, 490, somewhere in there. So that's a 25% increase in the space of 4 years. We hadn't grown 25% in basically like the last 20 years before that. So I like to kind of start with that because I think a lot of times these discussions are around the future load growth, right? Oh, all these AI data centers are coming. How much power are they actually going to use? Texas is already in the midst of just a massive wave of load growth already. Our rates here, which, Georg was saying, like it's gone up like 5%. Some perspective on that too are, there was this, and I distributed this graphic too. There's a great Politico article last week that showed the Texas average rates are below the national average, below most other southern states, which is direct opposite of what the Secretary of Energy has been saying. But it's interesting, that's like 10.2, 10.4 cents, something like that. When you actually break that down, our C&I rates, commercial and industrial rates, are extremely low. Not as low as Louisiana and some of our closest neighbors, but very close. Our residential rates are actually higher than any of our surrounding neighbors by quite a bit. And there's a couple reasons for that, but one has to do with how do we pay for transmission? And that's something that will need to change. But I would just say before I pass it over to my other panelists here that having renewables on the grid, and Josh can definitely talk about this, has helped to lower costs. The other sort of couple of big frontiers to help lower costs, one squarely in Gridraven's wheelhouse is using our transmission system more efficiently, just getting more out of what we've already paid for and that we're about to pay for, because we're about to do a big transmission build out to the Permian. And my hope is we'll have that build out go to the eastern part of the state too. As my friend Will McAdams likes to say, the small part of the state east of the Permian Basin also needs transmission. And when you put those together, you're talking about $30 billion. And I do believe that is an expenditure we need to make, but we have to make sure that the costs are shared fairly and that we're getting every bit of capacity and energy out of that system we possibly can, spreading it around to as many users as possible to drive costs lower. And then the other sort of big frontier is the demand side, and really focusing on energy efficiency, demand response, distributed energy resources. All of these things can not only lower system costs. So if you're somebody that like, I don't want to participate in demand response, I'm not interested in energy efficiency, I don't want solar on my roof, your costs would still go down as long as your neighbors and other people in your community use those things. And if you decide you do want to be part of that, you can lower your bills even more. So those are some of the things we're going to need to look at in order to really improve affordability going forward.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here, and I'm really excited to actually welcome Gridraven to Austin, Texas. As a native Austinite, I'm so happy that you guys are here. I love this innovative tech that you guys are bringing, and so I'm really excited to hear more about what y'all are doing. So looking out at the national average, yes, prices everywhere are going up, as Doug alluded to. But here in Texas, ERCOT wholesale prices are actually lower than they were in 2020. So this last year in 2024, they were lower than 2020, and that's even adjusted for inflation. And according to the national average, Texas last 2 summers have been lower than everywhere else in the country. So on the whole, our power is relatively cheap compared to other markets throughout the country. However, when you look at what's happening on customers' bills, there's a disconnect. People's bills are going up. They're seeing an increase in the prices. So the catch is that they're not just paying for the wholesale costs. They're paying for transmission, distribution, constraints on the grid, volatile fuel prices. So when families get their bill every month, they're paying for way more than what is being sold on the wholesale market. They're paying for everything else on the distribution side. So much so that around 40% of low and moderate income households are saying that their bills are unaffordable. Those households are saying that, and 1 in 3 of those households are saying that they're having to make really difficult choices between putting food on the table and paying their bills. So having to make those tough kitchen table decisions, am I gonna cut back on food or pay my bills, is what a lot of Texans are facing. And there's also an energy burden where there's an inequality. Around 12% of these households these households are paying around 12% of their revenue and their income on just to pay their electric bills, compared to 1% of wealthier households. So there's an energy burden and energy inequality that's happening here in Texas. And the constraints that we're seeing on the bill, the congestion constraints, are costing ratepayers around $2.4 billion. That averages out to around $150 to $200 a year for families. And so we end up having to pay that cost. So fixing the transmission and the constraints on the grid is going to be really imperative for us as we continue to grow.
Thanks, everyone. I'll also echo the sentiments. Thanks for having us. Excited to have you here in town. So I'll wear a few different hats, kind of in this initial kind of chat that we're going to have. So one is like we've talked about electricity rates going up. We've talked about wholesale prices going down. And I'll try to provide a little more context in there and color. Maybe we can have a little conversation about it. If you've been around Texas energy for a while, one of these things we used to care about was a thing called peak demand. Like it was like 4 p.m. on August afternoons when everybody's using the air conditioner. Now, like no one was writing articles about it this summer. Like no one was writing stories about it. No one was writing about thousands of dollar prices, $5,000, $9,000 prices at one time. And a lot of that has been to because we put so much solar on the system that we've got all of this extra energy, all this super cheap energy that's being, put onto the system, during the time whenever we've, want to consume that energy. Now that's just kind of kicked the hardest part of balancing supply and demand a few hours later. But now we've had this like wave of energy storage, kind of like first we had wind, then we've had a lot of solar, and now we've got a lot of energy storage that's also kind of filling those gaps. And just given just the basics of how Texas works, our wind and solar profiles, et cetera, like the shorter duration storage works well here in the state. Kind of that 1 to 2, 3-ish hour storage works pretty well. So we've had prices go down, but at the same time we are having this issue with rates rising. So now I'll switch and put my Austin Energy Commissioner hat on in terms of one of the things that I see or have seen in our meetings is that if you were to go buy a pad mount transformer today, it's going to cost you 200% more than it did in 2019. Right? Just everything is more expensive. Labor is more expensive. There's a shortage of labor to put these things in. Just all of the, we spend a lot of time talking about, the electricity generation and electricity use, but all the stuff in between, which is kind of what brings us all here today, has gotten way more expensive over the past few years. And so as we're building out more of the grid, we haven't even gotten to like the data center growth and all the stuff we're going to need to, connect that to the system. But all of that is more expensive. And if you combine that with the fact that, we're seeing more and more storms that cause, adjusted cost $1 billion worth of, damages, a lot more, heavy thunderstorms that take out parts of the grid that have to be replaced, and then all of this new large load is all competing for the same infrastructure in order to install it today. So if you look at like the trends and like where utilities are spending money, about 2010, about 25% of that was on fixed costs, like the wires, poles, transformers, all this kind of stuff. If you project that into the future and kind of look at maybe in the 2030-ish kind of cloudy crystal ball there, it might be close to 50%. So the percentage that they're spending more overall, but the percentage that they're spending on fixed cost, is approaching double what it was, about 15 years ago or so. And so, as we're talking about having, these, massive amounts of cheap sources of energy, and some of the work that I've done has showed it saved us tens of billions of dollars over the past decade or so. But if those costs are moving more towards the fixed side, we're really going to have to focus on, what do we do to make sure that doesn't just, blow up? How can we use the system we have, to a greater degree? We only manufacture 25-ish% of transformers like in this country, and we import, others. And so there's tariffs and other types of things. All of these things are putting upward pressure on prices as demand is, trying to grow. And so, it's a sticky problem, and I'm looking forward to, having more discussion about it.
Thanks. I agree with everything the panel said. I'll just underline 2 additional points on it, on the inflation side. First is pre-COVID, we had an equipment manufacturing environment where wind and solar manufacturers were fighting for market share and discounting price for their equipment. Turbine manufacturers couldn't sell a turbine and were selling at variable cost. And transformers and breakers, now all those things are back ordered 4 years and they're getting full price. So there was just a supply and demand flip pre and post COVID, in addition to inflation, where you went from kind of variable cost, close to variable cost pricing to full cost and more pricing. So I'll underline that. It really turbocharged inflation in the equipment side. Second thing I'll underline is pre-COVID, you could finance wind and solar and gas plants for less than 4% long-term debt. So we had a lower interest rate environment. And these are capital intensive projects, and your cost of money drives pricing tremendously. 6 years ago, you could get a wind PPA in Texas for less than $20 a megawatt hour. Now the average price is $55. Part of that is equipment, and part of it is interest rates, I believe, and inflation.
Thanks for the great overview of what's been. So as a brief summary, everything is getting more expensive. But perhaps one thing that I'd like to clarify for everybody listening who's not, we talk about price, but we mean at least 3 different prices here. There is a wholesale electricity price, which is the cost of producing a megawatt hour that a producer gets on the wholesale market that they sell. Then there's a price for commercial and industrial, which is sort of transmission connected large loads who pay less of the grid fees. And then there is a residential price or rate. The residential rate is the per kilowatt hour charge that residential customers pay, and that ends up being their bill based on the consumption. So there's 3 prices, and residential rates have gone up, wholesale has come down or stayed the same, and commercial industrial roughly as well. So the distribution of costs has changed, plus everything's getting more expensive. But there's also what I hear Joshua alluded to as well, that there's a positive story, because we're not talking about peak pricing on the wholesale markets anymore. If we had also high prices on the wholesale markets, we would be probably in a very difficult situation with everything going up. So thanks to wholesale prices, or the cost of production of energy at least being under control, despite the recent PPAs, the story is not as bad as it could be. So that's maybe something, but I like to dive a little bit into the incentives that utilities have, and then into transmission. So we've talked about building new things. What's the are utilities building as fast as they can, and what are they? What types of utilities maybe are there in the first of all, and what are their main incentives to keep prices affordable? Are the utilities motivated to keep prices affordable? And maybe I'll go to Patricia, you first, or Doug first.
You want me to go first? Yeah. So so this is also something I like to talk about a whole lot.
Really, Doug.
Like too much, perhaps. Actually, I was listening to a podcast on the way in this morning, Shift Key, where they had Congressman Caston on. Apparently, he's just filed legislation that is about performance-based rate making at the federal level. I need to look at that, see what kind of ideas he has. And there's some a little skeptical what you could do at the federal level, but I'm glad somebody's trying. But the basic thing here is, if you go back to the very beginning of the electric industry, right? So Sam Insull, who was Thomas Edison's right-hand man, literally, when he got off the boat, the first thing he did was go to meet Edison. That had been arranged beforehand, and Edison had him working on his books literally within 24 hours. Getting off the boat as like a 19 or 20-year-old man, ran Thomas Edison's businesses, because Edison was a great inventor, but had a terrible mind for business. Insull was really the one that shaped all that. He left and went to Chicago because he wanted to be out on his own, took a massive pay cut to go out to a tiny little utility called Commonwealth Edison, ComEd, right? Today's Chicago utility. And it's there that he, in 1898, made a first speech about, we need monopoly utilities. It's crazy to have 5 different sets of wires running across all these streets. And by 1907, the Illinois legislature had given him a monopoly in, I think it was 45 out of 48 states within the next 7 years. They also had monopoly utilities, PUC set up monopoly utilities, all of that. And there was good reason to do that. You needed to attract a lot of capital, right? I mean, the country was not electrified. You needed refrigeration. Air conditioning wasn't yet really on the scene, but like refrigeration, lighting, all the things that electricity, traction, the electric transportation running through cities, trolleys, right? All those lines have been ripped up, but they were pulled by horses until we could electrify them. All of these useful things, you needed to attract a whole lot of capital, and that capital needed to be assured that they were going to make money back, right? So a guaranteed rate of return, which was pretty high. I don't know what the rates were back then, but double digits, right? All the way through to the present day. That is still the utility business model for the regulated part of the business. So like in a lot of states, if you're in North Carolina, you're in Georgia, you're in Virginia, Utah, any number of other states, like that is still the vertically integrated monopoly utility is the way. In Texas, we in 1999 famously unbundled, deregulated, restructured, lots of different names for this. I don't really like deregulated because it's still a highly regulated industry, but unbundled and restructured. And you had competition on generation, competition on retail, but our transmission distribution utilities still have that same business model. And the problem with that is, if I am, Josh was talking about, what did you say, 200% increase on transformers? So if I'm a utility And so that price was, $1 million for the transformers I was going to buy. And now they're $4 million. I make 10% on every piece of hardware that I purchase and put in place, right? So I used to make 100,000 off the transformers, the same amount of transformers. Now I make 400,000, right? So in a weird sort of way, there is this perverse incentive to spend more. This is well documented. It's called the Avers-Johnson effect, or more colloquially, gold plating. People have talked about this for generations, and it still exists. This is not to say that utilities are bad people or doing bad things. They are following the incentives, right? All regulation is incentive regulation. What we really need to do now is flip that around. There's different ways to do this. The UK does it through something they call toe tax, where your total expenses make a rate of return. So that way you aren't biased against operational improvements, right? So instead of buying those all the transformers that are 200% more, maybe I could implement distributed energy resources and meet that same need at a much lower cost, or maybe no cost at all, because customers are willing to bring their own capital into it to put solar and storage. Now I don't need to upgrade my distribution system. But if I incent that solution as a utility, if I really try to make that happen, what have I done? I hurt my bottom line. Am I going to do that? No, right? So, and this goes for vegetation management, right? Not a capital expenditure. You don't make 10% off it, right? Putting in composite poles, you do, right? Dynamic line rating and grid enhancing technologies, you don't make 10% off that. Building new lines, you do. Now, I think we have to, and I want to hand it over to the rest of the panel to talk about this. Like, there is a baby bathwater thing here. Like, we have to be careful not to throw out what actually worked. And we can talk about that more if y'all want to talk about that more. I am not suggesting some complete upending, but I do of the utility business model. But I think it is not only time, it is past time. And I think it is necessary, given the affordability things Patricia just talked about, that we absolutely have to bend the curve on transmission distribution. In the IEA renewables report that just came out last week, I think this figure's wrong. I've emailed them to ask, but they said that in Texas, our T&D portion of the bill is now over 60%. Over 60%. So, I mean, we could drive the cost of wholesale generation down to zero and your bills would still go up. That's an absurd result. We have to do something about T&D to get more of these operational solutions on the T side and the D side, transmission, distribution, and
So basically what Doug is saying is that a lot of these utilities have no incentive to find other alternatives to increase transmission or without just building more poles and wires. They get financially rewarded by putting more steel in the ground, not necessarily based off of their performance and delivering the energy, but making sure that they're building out, right? And we need to build out, like as we mentioned. But building out can be a very lengthy process. It can take 5, 10, 15 years to get hundreds of landowners to agree to use their property to build the transmission lines. So it can take a lot of time. And in the meantime, our bills are continuing to go up on the residential side. I'm sure everybody living here is familiar with looking at the Austin Energy bill, or looking at maybe a bill that you get from your rep in the Houston area. Is anybody from the Dallas area, the Houston area, and the Austin area? Okay, so everybody's familiar with Austin Energy. I was shocked to find out that portions of our energy system still under monopoly. I didn't think we had legal monopolies in Texas, and in Houston and the Dallas area, we have legalized monopolies. But as Doug was saying, I mean, it works for a reason, but we're finding that so much of the costs are being driven up by just needing to put more poles and wires in the ground. So I work in the Texas legislature. I run a bipartisan legislative caucus with members in both the House and the Senate who are working on energy solutions. There was a bill that was filed the last legislative session by Representative Rafael Anchia from the Dallas area, who falls under the Encore service territory. And this bill would have helped to address a lot of these problems when it comes to these rising costs. This bill would have required the PUC and ERCOT to do regular evaluations of other types of technologies that can increase power through the grid. So grid enhancing technologies like Gridraven is doing that can increase power through the lines when it's cooler or when it's windy. Other types of hardware upgrades like advanced conductors. So ERCOT and PUC would be doing regular evaluations, and the utilities, when they go to apply to build out new lines, would have to say, these are all the different technologies that we've looked at, we've evaluated the cost and benefit of them, and we're going to consider using these as in our future build out. So this would have had a huge impact. It did pass the House unanimously, so it was obviously bipartisan. It got 128 votes in favor, 0 against. Unfortunately, it didn't make it out of the Senate, but it's those type of policies that we need to try to kind of break up this incentive that the monopolies have to not incorporate any new technologies.
Yeah, so those regions, like they're still under monopoly control, are called NOEs, or non-opt-in entities. Austin Energy being one of them around Austin. San Antonio, CPS, City Public Service, is also one. Plus a lot of actually the rural parts of the state under electric cooperatives are kind of in that boat. Yeah, I mean, I'm glad it was mentioned. I think basically a lot of it has been said. I mean, I think it's like yes and. It's like we definitely need new stuff, but we need to be using the stuff we have better and using the new stuff better than we otherwise would have been using it if we didn't have the newer stuff that we were going to use. I think I said that right. Anyways, but yeah, it because we're kind of in this situation right now where everything we use to like move electricity around is more expensive. And it's kind of like if you buy your house at the top of the market, that principal value you paid for it is going to stay the entire time you're paying off your mortgage, right? Like it's just going to be more expensive. You might be able to get a lower rate later, but if you paid $700 for it, it's not like you're going to get $200 back in a few years whenever the market corrects. So I mean, we've got to be in this particular time with all of these loads trying to connect and everything more expensive. I mean, I think we really need to be careful and judicious in kind of how we're spending money, because obviously we're already seeing it, impact rates and things like that.
2 minutes because TV has breaking news and we need to do a super quick interview. So I'm going to step in as a moderator.
Okay.
Continue.
That's a power move right there.
Yeah.
Can't control TV.
I agree with everything the panel said, particularly Doug's comments about how the incentives for utilities to add rate base. But I will add, we work at Grid United, we work in a lot of jurisdictions, other states around the U.S. Texas does have good regulatory oversight of the power sector. I mean, the PUC is very sophisticated. They're tough. We have lower rates of return on equity than a lot of states out there. And we have a very active stakeholder group, people like Josh, Doug, TIEC, that are well-informed and their voices are heard. So I agree performance-based rate making would be a great evolution. But in the meantime, as the more people like the folks on this panel and other folks speak up and participate in the regulatory process, the more the regulated model will work. Yeah.
So let's talk about transmission lines. It takes years. Sorry. Hello, I'm your new moderator. I'm Julie. I'm Julie. I'm a CCO at Gridraven, and I've been in the company for a year. I'm not an engineer, but I've learned a lot in 1 year. One thing that I do remember is that it does take around a decade to build a new transmission line. What we are doing with Gridraven helps with congestion, helps ease that. What is your take on it? How does the industry work, and what are the other solutions to relieve the congestion costs?
I'll just say that there's no easy answer to the question of how do you speed up transmission development and construction. And mainly the slow part is the development side. And it's fundamental to transmission. They're long linear assets, 100, 200, 300 miles. You're dealing with maybe 100 landowners and 6 county jurisdictions and the state jurisdiction and maybe federal land and lots and lots and lots of stakeholders. And, way back when they created the rights of eminent domain where you could condemn land and force landowners out. That sounds like a simple, fast solution to get land to build infrastructure on. but it kind of isn't, because those landowners and those politicians in those places where you forced them to sell their land, they come back around in the permitting cycle and they show up there and make life difficult. So, you have to, the bottom line of all that is the only way to speed up transmission build is to work really closely and collaboratively with the local jurisdictions and the landowners, so that they're all happy with what you're doing in terms of cultural mitigation, endangered species mitigation, eye lines. All of it has to be worked really, really hard. It just takes a lot of work. And it's fundamentally, there's no easy answer to make it go a lot faster.
I just want to add to that point. So I actually just got back from China about 2 weeks ago. They have $1.4 billion. I'm sorry, 1.4 billion people, and they're growing rapidly. They're actually building out a massive high voltage line way in the western part of the country, where they have high wind, high solar, not a lot of people, and they're moving it all the way across the entire country to the population centers, which are on the coastline, which don't have a lot of wind, it's pretty cloudy, so it's not very good for renewables. So to be able to transmit all of that cheap, clean power all the way from the western part of the country to the central population areas takes a lot of time, a lot of money. But with China being a centralized government with central planning, they're able to throw up these lines like that.
No hearings.
Well, yeah, I was about to say,
Yeah.
there is no easy answer unless you just shut everybody out of the process.
Yeah.
Just say,
Yeah.
nobody can have any input and only the government decides. So I really believe in the context of where we want people in the process here in the United States and in Texas, it just has to, you have to do the development right. It has to work with landowners and the politicians, and everybody's got to be happy. And you just have to do that work. And the faster you do that work, the faster you'll get your permits and you'll get construction started.
Yeah, I think there's a few things that we do well for transmission in Texas, and a couple things I think we could really improve on. One is, Texas is kind of unique in this, and that we have a mindset called connect and manage for generation. Essentially, we will connect generators to our system, even if we will have to curtail them at some point. And so we'll connect, and then there's the manage part. If we need to make sure that the grid remains stable, you can produce 200, but right now I can only have you produce 100 because that's what I need to keep the grid stable. That's what we do. In other regions, they have a thing called invest and connect, where if a generator wants to connect, they will make the generator make all of the sometimes deep network upgrades that it takes, saddle them with a cost. And so, the cost of building generation, other infrastructure, the cost of building the cost that the generator sees goes up, and it can slow the process down because it takes time to do all of these things. There's a couple things that I think we could do better here in the state of Texas. There's a couple different ways we can build transmission. One of them is for reliability reasons, like the power is going to go out. We're not going to be able to keep this stable over here, and we're generally pretty good at doing that. We do have an economic test, is like, if we build this transmission line, will the economics be favorable to ratepayers? The problem is that we only allow 1 year's worth of benefits to offset the entire cost of the investment, which is silly, because these things are multi-decade assets. These things are going to last, 60, 70, 80 years by the time you upgrade and do all this other kind of stuff. So
it never works.
Yeah, and it never works. We hardly ever build anything on the economic test because, again, it's hard to, it'd be like if you were to buy a house and you've got to pay for it in 1 year. That's going to be impossible for most people to do. So you pay it out over 30 years. And so, I think that's really, one, area where I think we could do a lot better. And I think we would see more transmission get built out if we were to allow it to be, amortized over a sane time period.
I want to do a follow-up because I agree 100% with Josh, but it would also be nice if the reliability and the economic tests were somehow blended together. I know it's hard, but it would be nice if we had a criteria that considered both at the same time, instead of, it's either reliability, did you pass or fail, or it's economic, did you pass or fail? And by the way, I think there's been one project ever done on economics in Texas. It's
in the last
unbelievable.
15 or 20 years. Yeah, and I Jack, am I not wrong though that like if you clear the economic hurdle, you would also almost always clear the reliability hurdle too, wouldn't you?
I think you're probably right.
Okay, yeah.
Can't say for sure, but
Well,
probably.
and I'm asking because there was a bill last session in addition to 5200, the Getz bill, I believe it was 3069, or was that the load flexibility bill? But there was a bill that was on the economic test that also passed the House and did not make it through in the final. The Senate was considering it. It was considered in negotiations, but it did not make it across. And that is an important policy change that could really make a difference. I'll just going to add just a couple points, Jack. You've agreed with me a few times. I want to agree with you on one thing in particular, which is that and for the folks that read my newsletter, they'll be like, wait, what are you saying? I often criticize the PUC and ERCOT. I do think they are very well run. I think that they are like, I often use this. People that listen to me a lot will get annoyed by this, but I like to quote Churchill when he said that like democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. It's kind of how I feel about the PUC and ERCOT. It's like yes, there are things I really wish they would do differently, and I want to hit my head against the wall that they don't. But when I look around the country and like what like the other ISOs and RTOs are doing, like we do connect and manage here, they're not really doing that anywhere else. So I do think that the leadership here at the PUC and ERCOT are doing what they can, and they're the right leadership. I think the key point I want to make here, and I think this sort of sets up Georg for after with the presentation you're going to do. But I think to this day, maybe the newsletter is growing and this is no longer true, but I think if not one of the most widely read articles I've ever written, I wrote on September 7th, 2023, the day after the only energy emergency that Texas has had since Winter Storm Uri. There has been one and one only. It was September 6, 2023. And what was happening was the way that the transmission lines were operated as a single contingency when there's double lines, that means they were throttling back power that could have flowed over those lines. To be fair to ERCOT, there's a risk. There's a reason they weren't doing it arbitrarily. They're worried about overloading lines and losing the entire line. But they were operating those lines extremely conservatively. And our frequency that night dropped all the way to 59.77. That is a very, very serious frequency excursion. And so my point in saying all that is, what did they do? After that, it's like everybody's freaking out. What are we going to do? We're going to build new transmission. That's good. We needed those transmission lines. Had we had an economic cost test, those lines would have been built years before, but they didn't pass the reliability test because the criteria are so narrow. Former Commissioner Kobos talked about this a lot at the time. But what they did was they then approved very quickly these new transmission lines, which are being built now and will probably be done somewhere in 2027. Meanwhile, we've got 4 years in between where that same energy emergency could happen, but now we have a lot more battery storage. And if we were to implement grid enhancing technologies and really use smart software to figure out how much power can go over those lines, we could probably forestall that kind of emergency just prevent that kind of emergency from happening again. But we aren't yet using those solutions. We are still not dynamically rating our lines. And ERCOT will swear till they're blue in the face that they do. But if you peek beneath the hood and what they're actually doing, their dynamic line rating is really like, if it's between this temperature and that temperature, we'll use this much. Between this temperature, and they're not taking the full amount of data in. So I'm hopefully putting that golf ball right on the tee for you.
Yes,
Right,
Jack, you wanted to comment on that?
No, you're right. I mean, that fundamentally, I remember September, and South Texas Nuclear was printing $0 per megawatt hour, and we were in EEA 1 or 2. Yeah, they skipped 1. Yeah, went to 2 for like 4 hours, and it wasn't like South Texas sits out on some radial in Brownsville. South Texas, probably the most interconnected generator in all of Texas, has 9 or 10 345 lines coming out of it. So it's like mind-boggling. It's just hard to understand why we would have congestion problems between South Texas and San Antonio in an event like that. Really hard to understand. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And then in addition to that, doesn't that drive up costs for the local consumers?
For the entire state, except the Corpus area, which was at 0. But yeah, the rest of the state was $5,000. Yeah.
You can start keeping some questions in mind as I'm starting to go towards a summary from the panelists. But just a comment also, we've been talking about Texas, but the eyes of the world really are on Texas. I have a fresh outside perspective, having just moved here. Everybody knows that Texas means business. And the energy market has been, real-time market has been one of the first in the world. It's been pushing the trends forward that the rest of the world is looking and really watching closely what's happening in Texas, because that is going to happen in the rest of the world in a few years' time. So these trends of cost increases, but also load increases, but also meeting those load increases. We need new generators on the grid and building new transmission faster than elsewhere in the country, which happens in Texas too. Everything's converging. But I would like to perhaps ask all of the panelists a view into the future. So we've now talked about affordability and tying that together with reliability, as in making sure that we have the power during the times we need. What do you see going forward in the next 5 years? Are there some trends or highlights that you'd like to point? What's going to be in 2030 the main story for electricity? You want to take that?
So as I mentioned, I work in the Texas legislature, and questions around reliability get very polarized very quickly. The debate over renewables versus gas is nearly short of fistfights. People get that passionate about it when they're talking about the supply side. But there really isn't going to be any sort of silver bullet when it comes to the reliability moving into the future. We're going to have to really create it as a stack. So first, we're going to have to make sure that we harden the system that we have. So when it comes to weatherization, making sure that all of our plants can handle extreme heat, extreme cold. Then secondly, we need to make sure that we're continuing to build out those shock absorbers, the batteries and the demand response programs, so that when we have these spikes, that it doesn't completely break the grid. So it's able to come in and mitigate some of those high peak demand moments. And then the third piece is going to be using the existing structures that we already have and unlocking hidden capacity, such as grid enhancing technologies, and using the systems that we already have. What is the fastest and cheapest way to increase capacity on the grid right now? It would be using grid enhancing technologies. It's fast and cheap, so we need to level the playing field so these technologies can compete and provide the fastest and the cheapest form of electricity.
I mean, making predictions are hard, especially when they're about the future. Either Yogi Berra said that, Niels Bohr said that, or a no-name Norwegian politician from the 1800s. I'm not sure. I got called out on by saying that out loud on the socials this week. Yeah, I mean, 5 years. That's 5 years used to seem manageable to look at. I mean, if you look at, I was just actually on another panel last night. I was talking about the large load interconnection queue. I mean, it's like triple what our current peak demand is in 5 years. So, I mean, I think we'll be talking about data centers and AI and their use. I think we'll be looking back at these projections and being like, yeah, that didn't happen. Not near as much of it. I mean, a lot of it is going to happen, but I mean, I think some of the breathless claims are what they are. But I mean, I think we're going to see with the new build of the Permian Reliability Project, the new transmission lines going out into super far West Texas. I mean, that just in my mind is basically opens up a whole lot more of the state to solar development. This is how they originally they envisioned like that the power on the CREZ lines would flow from west to east, and eventually it started flowing east to west whenever we started using more power out there. Right now, it's envisioned that this power is going to flow east to west out into the Permian region. I think eventually it's going to turn around. It's going to flow back west, to east, based on, just the resource, because the resource gets better out there and the land gets even more marginal. And I think we're going to continue to build that out. And then that's going to push a lot more, storage on the grid, because we're going to have even more solar than we currently do now. So in just like the 5 year, and maybe the Permian Reliability Project a little bit more than 5 years. But yeah, I mean, I think we're probably going to be talking about an electricity affordability, crisis at that point, because everything's more expensive and we're trying to build a whole lot of stuff when, the prices are at a premium.
I would just add that I'm actually kind of optimistic about the next 5 years, and for a couple of reasons. I've been kicking around ERCOT for 25 years, and I don't think there's ever been a time where the focus on reliability by all stakeholders has been this intense. We had Uri, we had the 25% demand growth. We got transmission build out that's like twice to 3 times what it was 5 years ago. I mean, everybody is focused on it, and it feels like we're just inching our way towards some sort of integrated system planning model that we need. We did the 1 in 10, and we did the durational outages and targets. We're kind of inching our way, and people want a solution. Every politician, regulators, everybody wants a solution. So I think we might get to some sort of integrated system planning that can be enforced in some form or fashion for the market. We'll see. But right now would be the time to do it because everybody's focused on it.
Yeah, I mean, there's always that tension, right, between planning and markets, and Texas always leans much more heavily to markets. But it's not, like so many other things in life, it's not 0 or 100 on or off. It's like, where are you setting the dial? I will say one of the things I think, it's easier to make predictions about the future if they're like already happening. So one of the things that is already happening that I think will be a major trend and will continue is we are seeing higher system utilization. We have not had a single day where the peak this year was what it was in 2024 or 2023. And you can say the summer wasn't as hot. It certainly wasn't as hot as 22, 23, or 24. Though I like to point out for people, we have recency bias. It was a top third hottest summer ever this summer. So like it seemed cool to you, right? But that's because of recency bias. And what I was just talking about with all that growth of demand, you would still think even with a summer that wasn't as hot, we would have reached that peak at some point, but we didn't. The minimum demand across the first 9 months of the year on average is up 10% over the year. I think it might be 8.5, 9, something like that. So minimum demand is rising. So what does that suggest? Like higher system utilization. And by the way, with the right like planning and regulatory structures around that, that is and could be even better for consumers, because that basic math problem, numerator, denominator, like, are you spreading the overall system costs out around a lot more users and large users? And if those large users, this is a huge if, are paying their fair share, and perhaps a little bit more to get speed to power, right? Because this is what data centers really want. It's like, they are, of course, they're thinking about beyond the 2030s, all these fun discussions about AGI and super intelligence and all that. But all the data center companies are like, what am I doing in the next year or two? Like they're literally buying like used up secondhand turbines, like old Caterpillar turbines from like 30 years ago, and paying massive premiums for like old turbines. They need speed to power. So would they pay more for a system that they can get onto quicker? Probably. So can that help lower costs? Yeah. So I think the higher system utilization, the spreading the use around among a larger customer base, if we do this in the right way, again, a big if, but there's potential not only reliability benefits, but also affordability benefits.
I'm very optimistic that Texas will figure it out. At core, it's the use of the right incentives and price signals to do this. What you've described as the minimum load increasing is is a reflection of negative or low prices at those times. With that, I would like to open the floor for questions. Please raise your hand, and then Dooley will pass the microphone to you.
Patricia's point was spectacular. We used to have a home in Dallas. We were the chased consumer between 4 power companies, and we couldn't, we could buy, but into any particular provider. Atmos, I think, is what we chose. In Austin, it felt like we moved backwards in time because of Austin Energy. Regulatory situations tend to benefit the incumbents. So I have a bias. I'll let you all know that. I work for the Department of Energy at Sandia National Laboratories, just so you can understand my background. What does it take to make regulatory activities move faster? Because it seems like the market and technology and good ideas like Gridraven are held back by the fact that we still think we have to debate in public forum. And we do have to take in everybody's needs, right? But we're doing it as if it was 1790, right? We're doing this bizarro thing. And my point is twofold. One is, it seems like Tesla virtual power factory could be power plant could be turned on in the Austin area immediately through a bunch of decisions that would benefit what you all talked about. But yet it's not. I don't know why that's true. I just got back from Iceland, and we asked the people there. They said, "Why aren't you full of data centers?" And because they have an excess amount of power generation, right? They have way more power than they'll ever have on that island. And they said, "Hey, we're not Ireland. We prioritize people over factory." So what does it take to change the regulatory status in Texas that the residential ratepayer is the benefactor of the investment, and the factories, as someone said, pay more of the share, because it's a reverse model. We're trying to draw industry in when we already have perhaps almost too much industry for the grid.
So if you look at like the ERCOT's ADR program, the virtual power plants program, it seems like the only organizations that have been successful at doing that are basically vertically integrated in when it comes to at least the communications. So if you look at Tesla, it's their battery system, it's their cars sometimes, it's their internet, it's their solar through Solar City, or well, I guess it's just Tesla now, and they're a retailer. And so they own that entire communication stack, which I think is extremely important. This is the same with Bandera Electric, the other org that's been able to do this through their ApolloWare program. They're a very progressive, for forward-thinking cooperative, rural cooperative. But they own the entire stack and the information layer, because they put fiber where no one else was. And so one of the criticisms during Uri was like, we've got millions of these smart meters. Like, why didn't we just roll the smart meters instead of rolling entire coarse, feeders and stuff like that? The problem is like we have all these meters, but we don't have the communications backbone to actually do very much. They're designed for remote connects and disconnects. And I think the number we could actually move is just in the thousands, whereas we would have needed to roll tens or hundreds or thousands or millions of meters per day in order to spread that pain around, which, would have made it a whole lot less painful. I mean, I'm one of the 4 million or 12 million Texans who lost power for 4 days. Like, I get it. It sucked. But like, I mean, it seems like that you have to have that entire communications channel to do that. And at least in Austin, like, we don't have that. We don't own the utility, doesn't own the internet, doesn't have all of that. And everyone who seems like they're trying to do it with third-party APIs and all these kinds of things just doesn't seem like that they're able to do it to the standard that was able to get in this program. Now, I think NRG is going to try this with like a gigawatt of behind connected things. We'll see how they do on that. But okay, yeah. I mean, So we'll see kind of how that goes. But it seems like, at least initially, you had to have the communications in place. And when I got my dissertation, when I did my doctoral work, I did it with Pecan Street, which has like highly instrumented homes across this entire region and others. And the communications, was one of the biggest lessons we first learned, that communications are key, and often residential internet is not as great as you think it is.
The PUC, who is working on implementing a lot of the laws that have been passed at the legislative level, is woefully understaffed and under-resourced. And even when they went under the sunset process and got a boost in their budget 2 years ago, they still can't keep up with all of the new laws that are being passed and being implemented. There was a great bill that was passed last session, the Texas Energy Waste Reduction Advisory Council, which would help all the different departments within the government coordinate on energy waste reduction to help lower cost and increase grid reliability. Great bill, passed in just one session, which is a success. It usually takes 3 bills to pass a session. And how long is it going to take them to get on that and start implementing it? I mean, they have so many other rulemakings and so many other things in the queue when it comes to the rulemaking and implementing. And so we're actually working on proposing a PUC fellowship program, bringing in young people with a background in STEM who have technical expertise and doing a full-time fellowship in the PUC commissioners' offices so they can provide additional capacity, help to implement some of the legislation, and then they get great skills and be able to be additional support in the rulemaking process and set them on a career trajectory in the energy policy.
So I'd want to answer the question, but I'll first say I'm board chair of PowerHouse and super proud of everything Patricia and the staff there's doing. That fellows program is so important. It helps young people like learn about the industry. It also gives the PUC additional capacity. They had 6 fellows during the last legislative session as well. So huge shout out. That is a huge part of it, right? It's just like having the people to do it. So just a couple quick things on this. Number one, we've been talking today, and you're going to hear more about technology innovation. Technology innovation is great. We need regulatory innovation too. The regulators have to innovate, and they're not going to keep up with the technological change. That's an impossible task. They just can't. That's an unreasonable expectation. But they do need to innovate. And I think one of the ways to innovate is to try to figure out how to set up new markets. So back to that like tension between planning and markets, right? You do the planning, right? Every distribution utility plans. It's in a black box. It's not transparent. It should be transparent. We should have integrated distribution planning or distribution system planning, however you want to say it, that is available to the market to see, and then invite technology entrepreneurs to say, hey, we're about to build a substation for $100 million. Could you provide a technology solution for less than that? That will take regulatory innovation. And that's where like that planning then can kind of meet markets. And I'll just leave you with one thing. The podcast I have coming out tomorrow is with Astrid Atkinson, the CEO of Camus Energy. They do this kind of software. It's not actually like Gridraven, but in the sense that they're trying to put software-based innovative technology solutions on the distribution system, like you guys are doing on the transmission system. And what Astrid told me on this podcast, which you can listen to tomorrow, was that when they do VPP, so like the ADR pilot, right? We have, that's regulatory innovation at its finest. A commissioner really pushed that through very quickly. It operates, we're getting 30 or 40 megawatts, but the ceiling's 160. Why are we only at 30 to 40? Because they're getting ancillary service revenues. That's what they're getting from those 30 megawatts worth of batteries. How much of the overall cost of power, Jack, is from ancillary services? So like, on your final bill, maybe a 1%. That's what they're trying to make a business off of in the ADR pilot. What Astrid told me was in the study they did, I think it was in Indiana, it was with AES, 75% of the value of VPPs comes from reduced distribution spending. Now we're back to the regulatory problem we were talking about before. The distribution utilities have no incentive to do that. So this is where regulatory innovation needs to meet the technology innovation, and we need new markets.
2 cents to your question about when will the residential customer get a little more attention than the industrial customer. I think when these transmission build outs like Permian start really hitting the bills and we go from 10.2 cents to, maybe 12, 13 cents, then you'll see the political pressure to try to flip things back a little bit between residential and industrial. Or if we saw a giant increase in natural gas prices, or if we had a lot more scarcity pricing. I mean, I think my residential bill pre-COVID was 8 cents in Houston. It's now 10.2, exactly like Doug said. That is like less than the inflation I've seen at like Kroger, right? So I don't think residential customers are up in arms right now politically, but give them another 10, 20% increase and they might get a little stronger.
You mean proactive policy, Doug?
We have time for one more question, I believe. You were first there in the back. She was a split second faster raising her hand.
Hi. Actually, I have two, but I'm going to make it easier. So the first one is, I just recently moved to Austin 2 months ago, actually, because I started a new business in nuclear energy. And the reflection of this conversation, even though the governor has mentioned that Texas should be the nuclear state, the reflection again of the conversation, none of you mentioned nuclear within the Texas grid. So did I make a mistake moving to Texas? That will be the first question. And then you mentioned it, but part of the energy grid here. And the second question is, if you imagine 2050, one bullet point, how do we achieve balancing affordability, growth, and reliability in Texas? Thank you.
I honestly don't think that if we don't get reliability right, like, we're not even going to consider the other things. Like, if this market can't do it, then they're going to re-regulate the whole thing. Like, I mean, and do something like they do kind of in the Southeast or something. But so that's when I would pick. I mean, you can only go so far, like, in terms of like the power going out enough that then the politicians start to re-regulate or rebundle or whatever it is. We don't want to call it. Yeah. Because they did it in 1999. They could undo it, with the same, stroke of the same pen.
I can't answer your question. There's not one thing. It's everything across from grid edge all the way back to generation and transmission. All of it needs incremental improvement. Sorry.
I'm going to escape your hard question and go to the nuclear one. I don't think you made a mistake moving to Texas as a native Texan. I'm sure, as you already know this, the state legislature passed a law and the governor signed it saying that creating around $350 million in funds and grants to give out to the nuclear industry to help incentivize and send a strong message that Texas is open for business for nuclear. They also are setting up an office within the governor's office that is specifically intended to help companies streamline the permitting process, because as we know, it can take many, many years. It can be very difficult. And so it's kind of a coordination point for companies to be able to go through that bureaucratic process more in an easier way. So I think that's going to make a big impact. And while we know $350 million probably isn't a ton of money for the industry, I think it's still sending a really strong indicator that we want people to come here to Texas to build. That being said, I don't know if you do fusion or fission, but there's actually a lot being done on the fusion front as well. And we're going to be doing educational activities around fusion.
Sea drift. I don't think the state is necessarily involved. I think, but yeah, there might be an incentive. So that's Dow Chemical is trying to replace some really, really old cogen natural gas with small modular reactors from X Energy. And I would assume they'll apply for that money. I haven't heard that they actually will. And by the way, that office is set up. Jared Schaefer was just named a couple of weeks ago as the head of the Texas Advanced Nuclear Office, TANO, Texas Advanced Nuclear Office. So that exists. So if you haven't gone over there, you're probably good to introduce yourself to Jared, another person at the state government who's doing good work. And I'll take your question. Okay, so you want our top priority, one thing. I wouldn't say that this, I agree with it's silver buckshot, not silver bullet. I wouldn't say this one thing will solve it all. But if you ask me what the one thing I think would do the most, you know what I'm going to say. Close. Demand side solutions, yes. So that Energy Waste Advisory Council, I think, is very important. Reducing energy waste. We use particularly in the wintertime, we waste a whole lot of energy with inefficient heat in poorly insulated homes. And our biggest reliability risk is winter nights and mornings when 3 million homes are using resistance heat. So they're using an 800 square foot apartment, uses twice as much power when it's 0 degree, not even zero, like 14 degrees as a 3,000 square foot house uses on a 100-degree day. That's a reliability problem. It's also an affordability problem because the people in those apartments are paying, it's 5 kilowatts that resistance heat is running at. So they're using 5 kWh every single hour during the night. That adds up. No matter what your rate is, your bill's going to be very, very high. And then growth, we can grow if we continue that trend of higher system utilization. So that means lower peaks, lower net peaks, not the summer peaks, not really much of a problem, but lower winter peaks and lower summer net peaks, which is the peak when the sun goes down, basically. If we do those things, we can free up a lot more capacity on the grid for not only data centers, but industrial electrification and semiconductors moving here, all that kind of stuff.
Thanks for the question. And just in energy, very often the first thing you have to agree on, what timeline are you talking about? So 2050, you have one set of answers. 2026, you'll have another one. Thank you so much for the panel. Thanks, everybody.